Thank you. The first thing I should say is that I'm not actually an ethnographer. I'm very flattered to be called one, but unfortunately I'm not. I'm a Slavicist. I'm a cultural studies person, so I'm in the Department of Russian Modern Languages. But I do borrow from social anthropological methods, so that's probably where the confusion arose. My topic today is taken from a broader body of research that looks into three regions of the Russian northwest: Novgorod, Pskov, and Vologda. This research has focused primarily on the questions of cultural preservation and local identity, and has examined how institutions of memory, such as museums and monuments, mold and determine the way in which people understand themselves and their communities. For the purposes of this paper, I've limited my focus to just one of these regions, the Pskov Oblast, and the question of memorial landscapes and their redefinition after communism. In this way, I hope to present one regional portrait in most of its texture and detail, rather than drawing a more impressionistic picture of cross-border patterns and tendencies, although I'd be totally happy to situate this presentation in the broader context of my research on the Northwest, if that's something that people are interested in hearing about in the questions and answers. So before turning to my analysis, I want to talk about the word, or the notion, memory, embedded in the title of this paper. Much valuable work has now been conducted on the processes of historical remembrance and the ways in which these are managed by political elites to shape notions of national and local belonging. One might cite the works of David Brandenburger, Karl Platt, Karl Qualls, Malte Rolf, among others in the Russian and Soviet context. My research engages with this corpus, but shifts the focus away from governments and elites towards individuals and local communities. My interest lies primarily in the social memory that Raphael Samuel and, in the Soviet Russian context, Catriona Kelly have striven to uncover in their work. This is the kind of memory that's produced in the course of everyday life, through a common sense of the past generated and perpetuated in everyday talk, through family tradition and habitual action, among other things. This more private sense of the past is intertwined with public discourse and often takes its frames of reference and symbolic vocabulary from public discourse, but nevertheless, in my mind, exists independently from these authoritative narratives articulated by institutions of power. So that said, I want now to turn to the region that's the focus of my paper, Pskov. So for those of you less familiar with the geography of the Russian Northwest, that's not very well at all, I'm sorry about that. Let's see if you can see us on my version. I don't know why it's not showing here. So Pskov is basically here. It has a border with Estonia, Riga, Belarusia, and then it has a border with other Russian regions within the Russian Federation. This status as an internal border region within the Soviet Union impacted on the local experience in different ways. In demographic terms, it had relatively little bearing, with Pskov remaining a predominantly mono-national republic until 1991. Sorry, a mono-national oblast until 1991. The Russian constituent of the population fell only slightly from 96.8% in 1959 to 94.3% in 1989. What's more, the drive to market the town as a cultural reserve, or a zapovednik, in the post-war period had an important impact on cultural life. It was marketed as a zapovednik of Russian architecture and culture, and within this paradigm there was little room left to explore non-Russian cultural influences on the region, although these were many and various. The border status of the region nevertheless had a bearing on the lived experience of Soviet Pskov. Proximity to the borders informed everyday practices in the region, from habits of consumption to forms of recreation and relaxation. And in the interviews that I conducted as part of my research in Pskov in 2008-2009, it was common for older residents to reminisce about trips they'd taken across the borders. I think something came up about honeymoons in Estonia earlier today, for shopping and tourism. And these types of activity formed an important part of youthful experience of life in Pskov for Soviet citizens. I've just included this. It's a translation from an interview that was taken by a colleague with her 88-year-old grandmother, actually, when her grandmother talks about the fact that she would take regular trips to Latvia, and there's in italics down here, I've just highlighted what she talks about, and which something that came up quite a lot in interviews, that you could tell the difference between the republics by the actual quality of the roads. You could feel it in the roads. And there's a suggestion here of an experiential knowledge of the region, which I think reveals in some way the familiarity that people in this particular region had with their neighbouring countries.
This isn't a one-off, I should say, it comes out quite a bit.
The border experience also wrote itself into Pskov's memorial landscape. In the post-Stalin era, when the cult of personality had been substituted for a cult of the people, and Leninist ideals of internationalism and friendship between the peoples were enjoying a resurgence, Pskov's status as a site of multi-ethnic interaction became a focus of commemoration. And the most striking example of this tendency was the local memorial, the Mound of Friendship, Kurgan Druzhby, which opened in the Pskov region in 1959. Yeah, this is a great photograph. The original isn't great either. So this is the mound, and here in the background is one of the trees that I'm going to be talking about in a moment. Oops. So, these are veterans gathering at the mound for one of the annual celebrations that took place around it. Located on the wooded border between Russia, Belarus and Latvia, the monument commemorated the patriotic narrative of collaboration between partisan movements during the Second World War. The mound was constructed from soil taken from the graves of Belarusian, Russian and Latvian hero soldiers, including the legendary soldier martyr Alexander Matrosev, who allegedly died after having thrown himself on a German pillbox in the Pskov territory. Out of this sacred soil grew, in inverted commas, 3 trees, a maple, a poplar and a birch, representing the peoples of Russia, Latvia and Belarus respectively. The symbolic meaning of the monument was difficult to miss. Out of the mixed heritage of sacrifice and suffering, the soil, grew strong relationships and kinship and solidarity, family trees, as it were. The Kurgan Druzhby benefited from substantial patronage during the late Soviet period. Resources were made available to organize regular meetings between groups of veterans from the 3 republics, while folklore groups and ensembles were sponsored to hold concerts at the site every year. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, however, these traditions were disrupted. The closure of the border between the Pskov Oblast and Latvia, which was reinforced following the accession of the Baltic states to the EU in 2003 and to NATO in 2004, meant that Russian veterans could no longer access the main memorial site located on the Latvian side. Despite commitments on the part of the Latvian government to issue emergency visas to Russian participants in the 1990s, a number of the veterans who did not have foreign passports, and so couldn't get the visas that they were offered, were unable to cross the border. Comprised as it was of sacred soils taken from a territorial entity that no longer existed, the monument became a poignant symbol for the collective experience of loss and deterritorialization that followed the collapse of the Soviet state. When I visited Pskov in 2008 and 2009, public interest in this monument and its fate had peaked. The local library was hosting an exhibition of photographs of the site, and local school children were carrying out projects into its history and associated traditions. In newspaper articles dedicated to the monument, the theme of sacred soils, forcibly divided, emerged at the center of a discourse of patriotic despair, to use Sergei Ushakin's expression. Local commentators pointed out the existence of signs delimiting the territory and the presence of border guards aggressively patrolling the limits of the various nations. This reality was contrasted with the organic fluidity and cross-fertilization between soils in the socialist period. While wreaths and bouquets had formed a carpet around the mound during the socialist era, journalists suggested, the divided soils of the post-Soviet monument bore neither fruit nor flower. And there were many references to the fact that there were no flowers here. The sick soil of the divided monument couldn't bear any flowers. The sense of dislocation and crisis experienced by the local community following the collapse of communism created space for the emergence of more aggressively patriotic narratives of local identity. Debunking the idea of the region as a hub for friendship between the peoples, local elites fell back on the myth of Pskov as a site of military resistance and a patriotic guardian of authentic Russian values. The trope of Pskov as a fortress town, valiantly defending the Russian lands against external aggression, was well established in the Soviet Krayevidение literature. Following the collapse of the atheist state, however, this narrative was infused with a new religious spiritual flavor. Pskov's military strength, which had allowed it to repel a stream of infidels and evildoers, derived from its historical status as a cradle of Orthodox Christianity, it was asserted. This spiritual strength would allow it to continue to lead the fight in the 21st century, this time against the aggressive expansion of the EU to the Russian border. This fusion of military discourses, military and religious discourses, was manifest in a letter sent by President Vladimir Putin to the town in 2003 to mark the celebrations of the 1100th anniversary of the first mention of Pskov in the primary chronicle. And here I just want to, again, direct your attention to a couple of things. So the fact that the letter underlines various kind of stereotypes associated with the town. The fact that it defended the Russian state throughout history, it was an outpost of the northwest, the characteristics of stoicism and heroism, and also this is mixed in with its deep spirituality, its place as the birthplace of Saint Olga of Russia, the wise leader of Rus. So I want to linger on a moment of the symbolic importance of the figure of Saint Olga for the town. The selection of Olga, also known as Olga of Kiev, for the role of patron saint of Pskov was by no means accidental. The mythological warrior princess was effectively embodied the fusion of military and religious ideals that formed the core of the post-Soviet level mythology. Olga, married Prince Igor, the son of the Novgorod Prince Rurik, was famed for having avenged her husband's death at the hands of the Drevlians in a variety of gruesome ways. Assuming the Kievan reign, legend had it that she had 20 Drevlian matchmakers who'd been dispatched to Kiev to win her hand buried alive. Other acts of vengeance included burning Drevlian ambassadors in a bathhouse, slaughtering Drevlians at a funeral feast for her husband, and razing Drevlian lands by tying burning paper to the legs of doves and letting them fly back to their homes. The warmongering princess was reputed to have left thousands of corpses in her wake, and never to have succeeded to the constant courtship of power-hungry suitors, preserving the throne for her infant son Sviatoslav when he came of age. This myth of the recalcitrant and husband-spurning princess was nevertheless superseded by another legend of Olga as the first convert to Christianity among the rulers of Kievan Rus. While the conversion of the Kievan state to Christianity is usually attributed to her grandson, Vladimir I, Olga, it was claimed, was the first ruler to be baptized in Constantinople and played an important role spreading Christianity throughout the country. As a result of her proselytizing influence over the country, Olga was canonized by the Orthodox Church and declared equal to the apostles in 1547. Her romantic image, conventionally shown with the Orthodox cross and the instruments of her baptism, became a favourite among artists in the 18th and 19th century, inspiring the likes of Vasily Surikov and Mikhail Nestorov, among others. So this duality, the duality between spirituality and militarism, which was at the centre of local mythology and embedded in the figure of Pskov's patron saint, was given comical expression on the local landscape during the 1100th anniversary celebrations. In 2003, the town was gifted two radically different effigies of Olga. It didn't solicit either of these, it was given to them. Both were given by Moscow sculptors. So the first was a pious vision of the saint and her grandson Vladimir at her side by the Muscovite sculptor and president of the Foundation for Slavic Literature and Culture, Vyacheslav Klikov, and the second, a more belligerent likeness of the local heroine, sword and shield in hand, by the notorious peddler of sculptural monstrosities, Zurab Tsereteli. This unusual occurrence, which seems to have come about as a consequence of competing relations of patronage within local government, gave rise to a lively public debate on the pages of local newspapers. From the correspondence, a general consensus emerged favouring Klikov's devout figure over Tsereteli's bellicose vision. Tsereteli's monument was consequently banished to the town's periphery. Talk about banishing monuments. Namely the square outside the Rishki Hotel, where, as one commentator put it, it could frighten away foreign tourists. In an interview that I conducted in 2009 with Margarita, an English language teacher from Pskov, she expressed her feelings about the two monuments. And here again, I'll just direct your attention to these parts in italic. She says she didn't think it was a monument of Olga to begin with. She thought it started out as the Georgian princess Tamara, sorry. I think that's some sort of variation on the Peasant Great Monument story. And she says that monument, the Georgian monument, doesn't quite capture the spirit, if you know what I mean. And then she says, you know the other one with the Slavonic characters with the flowers around it and everything, that one's just a closer likeness of our Russian spirit, she thinks. This was generally an opinion that people held. Clearly, the distaste people felt towards Tsereteli's Olga was as much a reaction to the crude and ugly execution of the monument as it was to the sculptor's interpretation of the historical figure. Yet, as Margarita's words demonstrate, local residents were nevertheless inclined to favor the notion of the town as a center of Orthodox spirituality, as referenced by Klika's monument, than to endorse the association of Pskov with the idea of bellicose militarism. So these same themes came up in perhaps one of the most bizarre and controversial monuments to open in Pskov in the post-Soviet period. This monument, the Svященный холм, the Sacred Hill, which was situated in Izborsk, was the brainchild of the ultra-nationalist writer and commentator Alexander Prokhanov. The hill was to be constructed from sacred soils, delivered to Izborsk from various sites of patriotic importance. The first stage of the monument's construction, which began in September 2007 on the Festival of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, saw soils arriving from places of local significance, which included attractions that were on the normal tourist trail, such as Mikhailovskaya and the Pskov-Pechori Monastery, as well as sites of imperial significance associated with towns, such as the train station in Dno, where Nikolai II was supposed to have signed his declaration of abdication, and also from the grounds of the Pskov paramilitary division, which had seen action during the Second Chechen War. The second stage of the monument's construction took place on the Day of People's Unity on the 4th of November 2007. At this time, soils were added from sites of national significance, including the Moscow Kremlin, the territories of the Hermitage and the Russian museums, quite interestingly also sort of cultural as well as military sites, as well as places of patriotic mourning, such as the Poklonnaya Hill Memorial Site and the Pikaryovsky Memorial Graveyard in St. Petersburg. Soils were also couriered from lands of Slavic legend and mythology, including Staraya Ladoga, the Solovyetsky Islands, and Kulikova Field. The monument might have remained the bizarre initiative of a marginal extremist, or semi-marginal extremist, had it not been for the patriotic turn in national politics that followed Putin's return to presidency in 2012. Capitalizing on the increasingly nationalistic tendencies in Russian politics at this time, Prokhanov and a number of his ultra-conservative associates formed the anti-liberal think tank, the Izborsky Klub, whose declared goal was, and here I quote from the website of the club, to formulate an ideology of breakthrough, essential for the liquidation of the monstrous backwardness affecting all areas of Russian life. The mound formed an important prop in the performative rituals of the club. Following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the club traveled to sites of the Soviet military history in the peninsula, including Sapun Gora and the Malakov Mound, to gather soils for the monument. And these were delivered with great pomp and ceremony to the site in 2014. Most controversially, in 2014, the club welcomed representatives from the so-called Novorossiya to the mound. These military commanders delivered soil from the Savur Mogila, a strategic height on the Donetsk Ridge, which had only days earlier been captured for the first time by pro-Russian rebels. In a broadcast made for Visti.ru, where this photograph is taken no, possibly not, no, this is a different photograph, but it's easy to find online. In October 2014, Prokhanov claimed that by unifying these sacred soils, the mound would acquire a transformative spiritual energy that would allow it to shape contemporary Russian culture and government. And it's worth quoting his words here in full to get a sense of the mysticism and irrationality at the heart of this project. I'll just read them out. You've got them on the board as well. And the idea emerged to raise a mound that would be a chalice, a sacred vessel, into which we could pour the Pskov lands, and together with them the Pskov times, and together with them the heroic feats of Pskov, and together with them the images and actions of Pskov's great military leaders, saints, and philosophers. This chalice would accept unto itself all these handfuls of soil and condense them so that all the Russian energy that had accumulated over the centuries would be compacted into one ball of light, one ball of strength, one ball of beauty, and it would fill our current age, and it would drench with its water of life the present-day Russian state. This energy would take its place in the hearts of our compatriots who are often weary, exhausted unbelievers. It would deliver unto them faith, strength, and triumphant fiery beauty. Okay. Prokhanov's words here reveal a heady mix of pagan esotericism, Slavic chauvinism, and a militant nostalgia for an imagined former empire. Most importantly for this study, they also express a belief in the redemptive power of the periphery as a space of spiritual strength and military vigor to restore and renew the morally impoverished center. Pskov here is cast as an alternative center, possibly of empire, a source of spiritual guidance and moral sustenance for the Russian nation. The gesture symbolically negated the active closure along Russia's western border, which had rendered Pskov a virtual dead end in territorial and political terms. Plekhanov's Sacred Hill thus reversed the act of division that had split the soils of the Mound of Friendship in 1991, reconstituting nation and empire through a rejection of politics and a return to the language of the sacral. The extent to which this kind of discourse resonated with the local community is difficult to determine. The project undoubtedly gained support from some prominent figures in local politics and culture. The most high profile of these was the governor of Pskov himself, Andrei Torchak, who fated the arrival of the Crimean soils. He was there welcoming them in 2014 and gave a speech in which he said, "The hill is a place of unity for all our people, a place of Russian historical strength and historical memory." And some statistics, although this is very light research, so I wouldn't stand by this if my life depended on it. Some statistics appear to point to a disproportionate rise in patriotic feeling in Pskov compared to other areas of the country. In a survey published in Pskovskaya Lenta Novosti in 2015, for example, it was revealed that 57.8% of 2,000 local residents surveyed said they felt proud about the annexation of Crimea. This compared to 32% of the nation who, according to a similar survey carried out by the Levada Center the same month, felt that same way. According to Plekhanov in his broadcast of 2015, the Sacred Hill had become a popular attraction for the local people, a site that was frequented by newlyweds during their photo rounds and visited by local residents who were delivering their own sacred soils from private graves and getting stuck into the project. However, anecdotal evidence from acquaintances that I know in Pskov who come from predominantly intellectual circles nevertheless suggested quite a different appreciation of the monument, as you might imagine, claiming that the site was generally either unknown about or disliked by the local population who considered its neo-nationalist associations really unpalatable. So just very briefly, because I know I've run out of time now. In the 2000s, Pskov really emerged for local and cultural elites and different actors with different agendas as a new sacral landscape along the lines of the Russian North, Vologda and Arkhangelsk, for example, for the Soviet village prose writers in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And the sacred nature of these lands really derived from this renewed significance of soil as a memorial substance, really. So what we see in these various monuments are the mournful commemoration of divided soils in the Kurgan Druzhby, to a celebration of the native soils of Princess Olga, to Plekhanov's project to reunify the shattered soils of a former empire. And I would connect this really with the importance that soil and territory plays for the region in particular. The fact that the closed border has had a really important impact on defining Pskov as a kind of local identity that's a dead end, a local oblast that's a dead end, that's at the end of a territorial entity that itself can be perceived as a kind of periphery to a broader cultural center. So this, in a sense, actually brings my paper into dialogue, really, with the excellent talk that was given earlier today by Madina Tlostanova, whose comment about the way in which sacred geography forms a means of negotiating liminality really kind of resounds with these same ideas that I'm raising here. So this kind of symbolic work, which encourages an interpretation of these soils as sacred and sees in them some kind of refutation of Pskov's status as a periphery and perhaps Russia's status more generally as a periphery, has had particular resonance for local communities in Pskov, whose lived experience of post-socialism has been informed by a reality of territorial isolation and a perception of external threat. In this climate, monuments that provide a means to cope with the bleak present and the uncertain future, that reimagine peripheries as centers and weaknesses of strength, have had appeal beyond their rightful means. That brings my paper to a close. Thank you.
Okay, so we now will move from Pskov to Yakutia.
So I'm going to
present story, Korolenko's story, Makar's dream, that he wrote in Amgas settlement in 1883 during his exile. And Amga is just... So this is Yakutsk and Amga is over here. So, we're kind of far from European part of Russia. So the prototype, so it was published 2 years later in the journal Русская мысль, Russian Thought, in 1885, and the prototype of the main character is based on a real peasant, Zakhar Tsykunov, in whose house Korolenko lived for some part of his exile, and he was in exile for 3 years. This is a peasant, and this is a photograph I believe Korolenko took while he was there. And also this photograph you can find in their 10-volume collected works of Korolenko, published in Moscow in 1953. And I analyzed the story as a hybrid ethnographic genre that comprises Russian and Yakut folkloric elements that follows the convention of the Russian Christmas story, but also expands and redefines its genre through this unique combination of Russian and indigenous Yakut cultures. So I define literary ethnography as a genre that gravitates towards the centrifugal model that Bakhtin described as the fundamental structure of the novel. Korolenko's Siberian stories, that I just discussed only one story here, even though he wrote short sketches, exhibit novelistic qualities because they contain elements of the heteroglossia, разноречие, narrational multilayeredness, it's Bakhtinian term внутренняя расслоенность, and hinge on mimetic representation of the multiplicity of languages, because we have here Russian and Yakut language, cultures, Yakut indigenous culture and Russian culture, religions, Russian Orthodox and shaman cultures, identities that are not integrated with the imperial center. I argue that there is no homogeneity within the literary ethnographic genre itself. Moreover, the discourse of literary ethnography is unstable and, depending upon the geographical location and ideological position of the writer, the key element of the relationship between the imperial subject and colonial object, народец, can be represented in a variety of ways. I also showed that there are multiple imperial discourses, and the imperial discourse coming into being contains inherent discontinuities and even contrary elements. So the empire is kind of fragmented. Since Korolenko's position towards aliens in народцы drastically differed from that of his predecessors, and one of them is Dostoevsky that I analyzed in my dissertation, he has a distinct ethnographic lens, and with it wrote a contrasting ethnographic account. I show that he engaged with the preceding tradition of ethnographic narrative inquiry in Dostoevsky's Notes from the House of the Dead, but he also diverged by creating his own unique diegetic mode. Diegetic means narrating, telling, and heteroglossic style of literary ethnographic narratives. So he engaged with Dostoevsky notes on 3 distinct levels. And Dostoevsky was in exile in Omsk, in the city closer to the border with Kazakhstan, spent 4 years, kept a notebook during his prison time, and collected folklore from different ethnicities of the empire, and as a result of it wrote Notes from the House of the Dead. And I know that Korolenko read Dostoevsky notes. So how is he different from Dostoevsky? First, he engaged thematically with the ethnographic explorations of the Russians and the aliens of the empire. Secondly, he utilized a different diegetic mode of representation, particularly in the ways in which he presented and narrated this ethnographic material. Thirdly, Korolenko's conceptual relationship towards different ethnic groups differed from Dostoevsky's. Korolenko's stories displayed a move away from ethnocentrism and toward a more polycentric, heteroglossic poetics of representing aliens and Russians, in fact, a mimetic representation. So a few words about Korolenko and why he was in Yakutia, why he was sent into the exile. So he was born in Zhytomyr in Ukraine, in Volhynia area of the Pale of Settlement. Korolenko was born in 1853 and died 1921. So he was exposed not only to his own Russian culture, but to Ukrainian, Jewish, and Polish cultures from his early years. And the exposure to heterogeneous cultural experiences, awareness of different social classes and denominations informed Korolenko's poetics, as well as position in relation to them. Similarly to Dostoevsky and his contemporary Vladimir Bogaraz, writer and ethnographer who was exiled to Siberia as well, he was arrested and exiled to Siberia, although under different circumstances and at different points in time. So, and Siberia becomes a site of a productive exile in Edward Said's interpretation of exile, for Korolenko and Bogaraz, or in Dostoevsky's case, imprisonment. So they used the time in the exile to study indigenous cultures. So Vladimir Bogaraz wrote a dictionary on Chukchi and collaborated with the Russian Imperial Geographic Society, and Korolenko was interested also in Yakut people, learned the language, and we know from the memoir that he spoke it kind of a little bit, and he weaved Yakut language into his memoir. So the first time Korolenko was arrested on the charges of participating in revolutionary activities in 1876. Second time he was arrested in 1881 because he refused to sign statement of allegiance to the new Tsar, Alexander III, and as a result of that, he was sent to a Yakut village, Amga, where he spent 3 years from 1881 till 1884. Although he spent less time in the exile than Dostoevsky or Vladimir Bogaraz, like them, as I said, he turned his exile into a productive experience by exploring and writing about the lives of the common people that surrounded him. So he wrote about prisoners, political prisoners, Russian peasants going native, and indigenous peoples. And he began his exile in Siberia after Dostoevsky had already died, and before Bogaraz would spend 10 years in the Yakutia area. In many ways, Korolenko's life, his exile, his social and political views, his participation in defending Votyaks, Udmurt people in the Multanskaya Delo of 1892, and Jews during the Beilis trial of 1913, both Udmurt and Jews were accused of ritual murder, and respectively his writings that came out of his exile experience with the diverse ethnic groups was in dialogue with Dostoevsky's works in a Bakhtinian sense, and with the future works of his contemporaries, Vladimir Bogaraz and Lev Sternberg, other ethnographer who was also a contemporary of his, and Semyon Ansky, a Jewish Russian ethnographer. Similar to them, he spoke on behalf of different colonial subjects of the empire, including Russian peasants, indigenous peoples, sectarians, Yakut people, Udmurt people, and Jews. So he shared with Dostoevsky and Bogaraz the social and political ideas of populism, народничество. I refer to Korolenko's writings from the time of his exile as Siberian stories, although he never titled them as such. So So their literary production that came as a result of their exile serves as a platform for the ethnographic study of local populations. So you can look at this literary text that he wrote as a result of his exile as an ethnographic material that tells you about Russian peasant, in this case Makar, who adopts Yakut language and clothing and customs. And similar to Dostoevsky and his contemporary Bogaraz, Vladimir Bogaraz, he was not an armchair ethnographer. Rather, he learned about peasants and indigenous peoples of Siberia from direct contact with them from this Amga settlement. So he lived among these people. Dostoevsky and Bogaraz lived with Chukchi. Okay, so now I'll turn to the story. So the plot of the story, Son Makara. On Christmas Eve, Makar leaves his house and gets drunk. Before returning home, he goes to the forest to check the traps, where he encounters his village rival and fights with him for a red fox, which escapes. After losing a battle with his village enemy, he falls asleep, dies, and sees a dream. And so this is the story, that's why I called it dream, because this is an important part of the story where he is brought to the judgment. And so the story contains a number of folkloric elements, both Russian elements and Yakut elements. The story is subtitled Christmas Story, Святочный рассказ, which was a popular folkloric genre and a form of storytelling on Christmas Eve. People would commonly gather to share stories with the plots of Christ coming and helping the poor and needy. And the stories often had a didactic function and often had three parts that consisted of hell, earth, and paradise. And we kind of will see these elements in the story. In Makar's dream, the relationship between these three elements is kind of ambiguous, blurred, but you can also argue that they are there. So in Korolenko's short story, Makar's dream, one could generate meaning of the dream by examining it as a Christian apocryphal tale of a Yakutified peasant who is rewarded for his earthly suffering, or one could read it as a hybrid Russian Yakut folkloric tale. So the story begins with a restatement of the folkloric idiom of Makar, who herded his cattle to the, quote, far gloomy parts of the country, Makar, on whose head every imaginable misfortune always reigns. So Makar, который загнал своих телят в далекие угрюмые страны, тот самый Makar, на которого, как известно, валятся все шишки. So henceforth the title of my paper comes from that. So this introductory sentence contains two well-known idioms that are superimposed on each other. So first idiom is about куда Makar телят не гонял, referring to the very far places, although in Korolenko this idiom is a realized topos. Makar indeed lives in the far places, the place that becomes geographically and physically concrete, the place that is materialized as Yakutia. It is also known that this idiom referred to the distant places of political exile. And the name Makar denotes a collective name which signifies a poverty-stricken and unfortunate peasant on whose head every imaginable misfortune befell. На бедного Макара все шишки летят. So this is the second idiom. Henceforth, from the very start of the dream, the narrator situates it into their recognizable idioms so that a well-informed reader would know that nothing good will come out of Makar's dream. So, Makar is not only a Russian muzhik. Instead, he is a peasant of a hybrid I call it hybrid Russian Yakut cultural identity. Quote, having married Yakut women, they adopted the Yakut language and Yakut customs. The distinguishing features of the great Russian tribe were becoming erased and disappeared. Женясь на якутках, они перенимали якутский язык и якутские нравы, характеристические черты великого русского племени стирались и исчезали. The traditional notion of what constitutes a Russian muzhik is kind of destabilized here. His identity is unstable, I argue, rather he culturally assimilates to the indigenous cultures, so to the Yakut culture. This doesn't imply that all Russian peasants in Yakutia were like Makar. The narrator blurs the characteristics of their, quote, great Russian tribe, end quote, and Yakut cultures. At all events, my Makar adamantly remembered that he was a native peasant of Chalgan. It's the name of the village where he lives. He was born here he lived, here he anticipated to die. He was very proud of his knowledge and sometimes cursed others as, quote, foul Yakuts, end quote. Although, to tell the truth, he differed from Yakuts neither in his habits nor in his lifestyle. So this was a quote from the story, I think. So why in Russian it's foul Yakuts, pagane Yakuty, that Makar despised paradoxically, as the narrator admits, were very similar to Makar because he was a Yakutified Russian peasant. And the phrase pagane Yakuty is reminiscent of a well-known fairy tale trope and Russian epic poem Zadonshina, The Battle Beyond the Dawn of 1390, where Tatars are referred to as pagane Tatari. So in Makar's dream there are also Tatars. They are settlers, поселенцы Tatары, are the ones who sell Makar vodka, although of a poor quality, made of tobacco, that brought feebleness and illness upon him. So that's why he gets drunk on the eve of Christmas and kind of gets lost in the forest and dies. And the word pagane denoted the pagan, non-Russian Orthodox, and therefore viewed in the folk imagination as unclean, foul. The omniscient narrator tells us that Makar spoke only, quote, a little bit of Russian and rather poorly. He was dressed in the animal skins, wore terbasa, and terbasa are boots, you could see, made from deer skin. Continuing the quote, when he got ill, he called for the shaman who, ragingly gnashing his teeth, would jump upon him, trying to scare and cast away from Makar his maladies. End of the quote. The exorcism of spirits performed by the shaman was depicted relying upon a folk tale trope and a recognizable archetype. I think this evokes Kashey the Immortal, Kashey Besmertny, a villain and a sorcerer. So once drunk, once intoxicated, he goes to the forest to check the animal traps, and there he fights for a red fox with his neighbor and enemy Alyoshka, but he loses the battle, and I argue this is another recognizable plot catalyst. It anticipates Makar's death since he loses the battle along with his hat and gloves, then falls into the snow and dies. And "I Makar umir," says the narrator. And then he sees a dream. So what is the most important part? So what is in the dream? Makar meets in the dream the priest Ivan, who takes him to the heavenly court of Tayon Starosta. Tayon is a name Korolenko uses. It's a starosta, a village head of Inarodse. And first Makar is turned into a gelding, Merin, because of his drunkenness, laziness, and swindling. So he was turned into the horse, gelding. Then Tayon's son, who evoked Christ, interferes and asks his father to let Makar talk. After a very visceral, eloquent, and persuasive speech, Tayon and his angel workers were so touched by Makar's wretched and destitute life that they cried. And this is a very important part because this is a part when Makar, for the first time, becomes articulate. So when he comes to this heavenly court after being a gelding, I don't know for how long, he is forgiven, and then he talks and in front of the village head, Tayon, and it's a free indirect discourse. And suddenly Makar, who did not say much during his lifetime, obtained, quote, the gift of the gap, end of the quote. Quote from the story, beginning of the quote. He started to talk and he was surprised. It appeared as if there were two Makars. One was talking, another was listening and admired. He did not believe his own ears. His speech was flowing smoothly and fervently. Words were chasing one after another, as if surpassing, and then formed long, well set up rows, end of the quote. Contrary to the proverbial Makar, Yakutified Makar is challenging the passive depiction of the poor fellow on whose head all misfortune fell. Here Makar does not appear, quote, so foolish as he seemed to be in the beginning, end of the quote. He objects to being turned into a gelding to the church custodian and literally reverses his fate so that the scale with his sins goes up and the scale with the virtues goes down. So I think I don't have much time, but the dream contains a number of words that come from Yakut culture. So the clothing, the markers of clothing. And on one hand, it illustrates the ethnographic aspect of the story, and on the other hand, the narrator's statement that Makar was getting Yakutified. So the word Yakutified is not used in the story, although he does in his memoir, History of My Contemporary. And describing the local peasants as Yakutified, объякутившиеся крестьяне, he states that Russian peasants were referring to themselves by the word pagaный, which is derived from the corrupt Russian word pashenny, meaning the one who plows, and that they lost, quote, features of Russian national character, end of the quote. In his memoir, he writes, beginning of the quote, men were still speaking Russian, although with a thick Yakut accent. Women spoke only the Yakut language, as if ashamed to speak Russian, end of the quote. Yakutified peasant did not differ from the indigenous people. Similar to the Yakut, they went to church. Yakuts were Russian Orthodox, although some believed in shamans. I mean, mostly, I would say, not. It's interesting that in this memoir, Korolenko states that, quote, they perceived priests as Russian Orthodox shamans. Whether Makar's journey from hell to great judgment is a dream, as the title suggests, is not so explicit. So it's kind of open-ended nature of the text, and its ambiguity encompasses a lot of folkloric devices, and one of which is a trope of dream. The dream that Makar sees is a very recognizable literary device, and that juxtaposes Russian and Yakut folkloric and mythological tropes. And this cultural hybridity is a distinct cultural symbiosis that create a dialogue of cultures of Russian and Yakut that sometimes substitute each other. So instead of a Russian Orthodox priest, Makar would go to a shaman that creates a new language, I mean this heteroglossia, a mixture of Russian and Yakut, as well as new cultural awareness and codependence, as well as creates a new cultural awareness and codependence. Without diminishing Yakut or Russian cultures, Makar's dream depends on both of them. And I think this is a great departure from Dostoevsky's position in Russians as a God-bearing people. Okay, and that's it. Thank you, sorry.
Right, thank you very much, each speaker. And let's go directly to the questions. As we have a microphone, and if you raise your hand, and please introduce yourself as you ask the question.
I've done it already in the morning, but I will repeat. I'm Alla Anisimova from Novosibirsk State University, and I have questions to two presenters, to Tyler and to Victoria. And first of all, I mean, it's a fascinating session in terms of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity. We've got presentations from history and cultural studies and literary studies. And, well, I have sociology background, so maybe my questions would be strange for you, but it seems that you both tend to try to study regional identity, right? And Tyler, you have in your title, in the title of your presentation, Gulag returnees, right? And but it seems to me that you do not study regional identity at the individual level. What you actually do, you study identity of the region, like constructed by elites or, you know, regional mythology. Maybe I didn't get quite your point, but that's my impression. And same comment to Victoria's presentation. Again, you interview politicians or opinion makers, or maybe use media data, no? Like, did you actually ask simple people living in Pskov what do they feel? How do they feel? What does it mean to be Pskovian, and what their regional identity is? I mean, it's not a point of criticism maybe, but I just want to clarify, how do you actually see the issue, the notion of regional identity? So if it makes any sense, but that was my comments maybe, and question to both of you. Mm-hmm.
Hey, thank you for your question. So yeah, I was heading down that road of individual regional identity and that was part of the larger paper that I wrote. And when I pared it down, I think that's one of the things I lost in trying to get a larger regional focus. But one of the things that so my larger dissertation project looks at Gulag returnees after 1953 in the Komi Republic, like through the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I am very interested in individual identity and how those people managed to reintegrate into Soviet society afterwards. And so this paper is sort of like a larger capstone of that bigger project. I tried to examine and choose a couple of memoir examples that spoke to how individuals contribute, or how individuals form their own, I guess, identity from their experiences, and how they contribute to the larger, I guess, collective memory and regional identity through this Memorial project. But I ran short on time, so I think I lost part of that message. Yeah. 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 Yeah, no. So like the individual's life stories and they write them down in these memoirs. I was looking at those as individual self-identifications, and then representations of this larger thing that happened to them, and then that they're trying to contribute to. Does that answer your question? Kind of. We can talk more about it, 'cause, yeah.
Well, the two interview excerpts that I included in the presentation were with ordinary people. Perhaps you got the wrong end of the stick. So the first one was with a grandmother of an archivist who had been born in the Pskov region. She wasn't in any way a member of a political elite. She was a seamstress, son of a daughter of somebody who'd been a farmer, who'd migrated himself to the region, but she was born in the region. The other one, which I quoted, I think, was from a language teacher in Pskov. So again, not somebody who was a member of the political elite. So in fact, it's a really fundamental part of the methodology. I mean, in this presentation, I was sort of incorporating all strands, so trying to show how kind of public discourse informs and shapes how people think, but how there do exist these very kind of well-formed opinions which are based on, you know, everyday exchanges, gossip, jokes, anecdotes, the way in which people interact with the lived environment on an everyday level. These things exist and have just as much validity in terms of determining what urban space means and what local identity is as those public discourses. So you're...
These pieces of the interviews, I took it more as a reaction to the public discourse which already was constructed by political elites, regional or federal. When you take this Mr. Putin's speech and this, you know, interpretation of Olga's, Knyazhnya Olga influence, and then you have this sort of reaction of ordinary people to what was already constructed.
Right.
If you see the point.
But
I mean, it's interesting as well.
To reflect one's methodology, you know, entirely in a 20-minute presentation. But I mean, in
lack of time.
Right. So, but in the book, I'm trying to do what I said I'm trying to do.
Okay, thank you.
Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Georgetown. I have a question for Tyler on the Komi Republic, because I really appreciate your point about the multi-ethnicity and the changing nature of the Republic due to the Gulag. I'm also interested in Komi and whether in your own perusal of the memoirs you ran across Komi themselves, perhaps intellectuals, perhaps not, who were repressed, whether they were sent within Komi or whether they were taken away. What's the resonance with local communities and the Komi themselves?
Yeah, so actually a direct anecdote to answer your question. So my first Russian teacher ever was Komi, and that's actually where I started to study Russian and even learned about this topic and many years ago, and now here I am today. But so memoir-wise, I haven't so much found ethnic Komi people writing about their experiences in exile in the Komi Republic. However, that being said, when I was studying in Komi, my teacher, like I said, was ethnic Komi, and I went with her to her native village in Izhma, up north, or further north than Syktyvkar. Syktyvkar is already north. And her grandfather was repressed. He was a reindeer herder as a kulak. Okay. And so police come to this house and said, "You're a kulak. You have 3 reindeer." 3 reindeer. And he says in response, "They're reindeer. They're in my yard." And so it's like, okay, well, they arrest him anyways. They arrest him and process his papers. And he says, "Where are you sending me?" "Well, nowhere. You're already here." So, I mean, he was already far enough north that they didn't send him away, and that's kind of a cute analogy of repression, but still, yeah. Yeah.
Saha were arrested.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they definitely were sent farther north or anywhere but their own home village.
Yeah.
And the reason I was asking the question is that I really do know cases of Native intellectuals who met people in the camps. I mean, it was mixed ethnic, but it also included locals. And then that resonance back in terms of what happened in these communities also is part of the story.
Yeah, and that's something I'm still doing. I'm in the early stages of research of the dissertation, and that's something that I am looking for and have an eye open to. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Victoria, fascinating story about St. Olga. And I realize you didn't have time to deal with everything, but in the aspect of history being brought up for the memorial, were the Teutonic Knights mentioned? And Scoff's relationship, which would be rather inflammatory. I noticed in Putin's letter he didn't mention them.
Have you seen anything about that, actually?
You haven't seen it? Oh, that's an interesting omission. Yeah.
Susan Smith-Peter, a question for Susan Smith, appropriately enough. So my question is, I like the idea of sort of cultural power, and I wanted to have you just sort of talk about that more. And I also thought it was really interesting that here they are sort of commemorating that principality, because that was something that I expected to find when I started doing my work in Vladimir, and in the pre-reform period. They rarely really talk about it aside from a very kind of straight historical narrative of, in X years such and such happened. So if you could talk about, why the principality started happening sort of after pre-reform, and then, cultural power, and how you see that at work.
I think in relation to the oblast, I think in relation to the idea of the oblast as this larger principality, in Yaroslavl it's the Rostov Suzdal, in Vladimir it's Vladimir Suzdal. They're trying to, one of the big struggles that the archival commissions in this region had was defining themselves as different and yet intrinsically and ultimately Russian. And so my guess is that if we could recreate these museums, they would all look very similar to one another, and from what little we can tell from the pictures that were taken in the museums, that happens. And I think the Oblast Congresses were a way of recognizing similarity. They also refer to the Great Russian Tribe and trying to get at that idea. They refer to their region as the cradle of the Great Russian Tribe. Vladimir at this time is not 100% Great Russian, but it is close. And I think it was a way of building on those networks that they already had. And this is the importance of people like Selivanov, these ranking servitors that move around the country. So Selivanov created the Ryazan Archival Commission. He created museums in Siberia. He was involved in the creation of this. So it wasn't necessarily that they were even natives of the region, but they were local, at least for a time. And I think these ties in between the individuals in this region made this a very appealing idea, to get more of that moral support, to compare notes about regions that they all considered to be very intimately related. Why that happens when it does, I think, is probably, in relation to the archival commissions, a question of all of the regions finally having archival commissions. Vladimir's was late, for reasons that are a little unclear to me, actually. In terms of the cultural power idea, it's not, and this is not maybe a particularly good translation of kulturная sila. I didn't really know how else to get that idea across. But it's something you don't see explicitly very frequently, but they do use it in this case. And I think in their particular case, in the Vladimir case, because the conference was supposed to be held in 1905 and it was postponed, although nowhere do they say explicitly for political reasons, there are other reasons given. The housing wasn't ready and there was an outbreak of disease and so forth, that it was more of a struggle for them. I think the other thing that's different about the Oblast and Vladimir specifically perhaps is that because it is directly on the train line with Moscow, one of the reasons it may have gotten an archival commission late is because the Moscow Archaeological Society was so involved in the region already, and because of places like Dmitrievsky Sabor, Uspensky Sabor, the Avarov estate, for example, that the Moscow Archaeological Society had actually been overlooking the area anyway. And so there was perhaps less need for some people anyway to do this. And so I think that was another reason for the Oblast, is that these are the areas that have fallen under Moscow's sphere of influence, really, and directly. And so they're kind of coming into their own at this time. So, although still recognizing the cultural power that Moscow or St. Petersburg and their scholars have. So.
Yeah, I'm Yulia Gradskova from Södertörn University, Sweden, and I have a very short question to Nadja. If you happen to know what was happening after with the Soviet power and all the special census and politics, when kind of such a polymorphic national belonging could not be tolerated. If you have some idea what was happening, how they were classified, because it is very interesting, like, I mean, for the future. Thank you. discussing the peasants who go half Russian, half Yakuts, according to your presentation. So how they go classified later? Do they just Yakuts?
So this is, can you hear me? So Makar is a Russian settler.
No.
Use the other mic, please.
Okay, so I interpret Makar as a Russian settler who, I don't know how long he has been living in this Yakut settlement, but so Korolenko observes this notion that Russian peasants, so Russian settlers, start to adopt culture that surrounds them, and that's, is he half Russian, is he half Yakut? I think it's, I would say, he has the cultural markers of Yakut. You know, he speaks Yakut language. He wears, clothing, Yakut clothing, because he has to survive somehow. He lives in, I didn't show it, but he lives in Yakut. You can, next, further. Anyway, so, can you go back? Yeah, here, this is actually a drawing that I didn't show, but where he lived. It's very simple wooden construction. I don't know how you could live it. Can you, Michael, can you put the next one? And this is actually drawings, I forgot to show about them, of Yakut people that Korolenko, made. He was, seems like some, painter, and it's very ethnographic. But what I was arguing that, I don't know about Soviet times what happened, but I'm more interested that this Russian kind of hybrid identity that, instead of just being, they kind of expose this nuanced notion of what Russianness is. As I argued, depending where the writer is, where was his exile, he would produce a different literary ethnographic work. In this example, kind of tells you that it's one of the types of Russian kind of peasant, I don't know if I answered the question.
So do we have time for another question? Okay. Just somewhat quick, hopefully, but I just wanted to think with each one of your wonderful papers, they were all really interesting, about that process of sacralization. With Victoria, I had this strong feel, and the Zita Clues BUVA, just in case somebody's interested out there. Anyway, it seems very much like a move from the center. And it doesn't seem to have a lot of purchase from what I'm getting, but maybe you could talk about that among ordinary Pskovians, right? Pskovici, or whatever they're called. And I did remember, too, the Prokhanov, that archaeological dig in Господин Gexagen, that toward the end of the novel, is that kind of a preview in a way? It's digging rather than building a kurgan, but sort of related, right? But then with the Gulag returnees, it seems, is there sacralization going on? No, Komi is a very separate republic, right? And it's being used as an economic opportunity. Then with Susan, any process of that sacralization going on? And Nadja, so it's a Christmas story, and it's about being, in a way, pagan, and then, I don't know, overcoming that. I don't know, maybe you could talk about is it sacralization or is it just play? Just comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Edith. Well, yeah, I'd agree entirely. I think there's a process of sacralization that's entirely being driven by the centre. Yeah, I wouldn't argue at all that this is a local grassroots initiative by any means. As far as the purchase of the kind of ideology that's being articulated behind these monuments is concerned, well, I mean, it's quite a, and I think this sort of speaks to your question too, actually. I mean, most monuments for a person who lives in a town, you just don't notice them, do you? They're invisible for the large part, unless you're actually kind of showing them to people. So they can have a kind of very alternative functions. And that's the case, I think, to a great extent in Russian provincial towns. Often monuments have alternative names, they have alternative meanings, they have kind of urban functions as meeting places. I mean, in a separate part of this paper that I was writing before it became excessively long, I was thinking about, you know, how monuments work as sort of the fabric of everyday life, and, you know, they have these functions, and usually sometimes subversive functions which subvert their kind of pompous, bombastic, overbearing meaning, which is articulated by the centre, if you like. So I think that's important, and that's something that I am thinking about as well as looking at, you know, what's being articulated on behalf of the Berkovich in terms of the memorial landscape. And you're right about there being kind of a textual precedent for Prokhanev's monument. Working again. I think even more importantly, there's his book, Holm, which is actually the textual kind of equivalent. That's something I'm trying to think about. I'd be interested in if anybody's thought about this. Actually, Sander Brouwer has worked on Holm and on Prokhanev and Dugin and their notions of centre and peripheries in their texts. But yeah, that book was written at the same time as the monument was actually being constructed. So there were two types of construction going on, textual construction and actually real life construction simultaneously, which is a really peculiar thing to be happening.
Hey. All right. Yeah, so in sharing the little anecdote at the beginning, I wasn't trying to suggest that this entire enterprise is all about making money and the Komi economy. I mean, the site, so the site that I didn't really get to talk about, the burial ground, is very sacred. It's seen as sacred earth. It's a very sacred site, especially that man and the other people who lost family members in Komi. But also even the monuments themselves, I mean, they take on this the shape of orthodoxy and repent, and even the fallen Pogiania, the repentance collection. So it is a very sacred project. And if I were to be so bold as to make a critique, is that you know, not just Christian Slavs went to the camps in Komi. Lots of different peoples, lots of different faiths went there, and so that's maybe one of the problematic things with the Sixth of Carmel Memorial is the chapel, the monument chapel.
Who decided to give it this Orthodox?
Who decided what?
To give it this Orthodox profile.
It was regional officials that decided that the little shrine was the best mode of representation for the public, which, you know, as I said, is still it's far, deceptive. It's quite a hike to walk there, and I mean, if you don't go out of the way to see it on the way to the airport, then you're not going to see it. So, yeah, I mean, it is very sacred.